Welcome back to the Reptiles and Research podcast. Now, we've not done an episode in a while. We've been prioritizing other content, but now we're back and we're back on it. So today's episode, we have got Herpetological Highlights joining us, talking all things how to be a herpetologist, the avenues and the routes that you go through to become a professional herpetologist, what they think about wild-caught animals, what they think about is breeding in captivity of conservation value, and everything in between. This is a really good episode. It's really, really nerdy. So if you like that sort of thing, you're going to really, really enjoy this. And without further ado, I'll let you get into it. Enjoy. Thank you guys for coming on. Obviously, you are from Herp Highlights. How did you start, and why did you start the podcast?
Okay, so me and Ben, we were already friends. So the story of me and Ben is that we met in 2014 and we were both volunteering on a research project.
2015.
2015? I arrived there. Okay, 2015.
It's 2015.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, somewhere around it was 2015. We met and we were both volunteering on this research project, which was tracking venomous snakes in Thailand, in Sakharat, in like northeast Thailand. I was working on the green pit viper telemetry project, and Ben was working on the King Cobra spatial ecology project, and we kind of like became friends. We got on really well, and we both wanted to do like more education after that, because at that time I think I had a master's degree and Ben just had undergraduate degree. So we basically started writing these applications to like sort of like we're going to apply as a team. So we wrote these
Which, to be fair, like I feel like that should be a more common thing, like a more accepted thing. Because like you get master's students helping out on PhD projects, so why not come at one where that's already sort of baked in?
Yeah, so we did the whole like we'll apply as a team, and we emailed a bunch of universities and tried to get funding for this project we wanted to do on adder ecology. And most people got back to us, but the whole like funding situation was difficult. It was really hard to find money for like scientific research on snakes. What I ended up doing was Ben ended up taking up masters at Bangor University, and I also ended up getting a PhD, but like unrelated subjects. But we ended up both going to the same place, which was very fortuitous, really.
It was lucky. Yeah, it was damn lucky.
That part of the story was really just luck. And then obviously we were good friends, so we were spending a lot of time together. I had my own flat, Ben would come round. And I just said to Ben one day, because I already listened to a bunch of podcasts about reptiles, but at that time there wasn't really one about herpetology specifically. There was herpetological discussions by
Yeah.
Justin Julander, but I think he'd stopped doing it. It'd kind of gone on hiatus. I listened to all of those. I thought they were great. And then so I said to Ben one day, I was like, "Oh, do you want to start a podcast?" This is my recollection anyway, Ben. Maybe I'm just taking the credit for the idea, but and
No,
then
no, I think it was, but I think what worked really nicely was me looking for that sort of podcast anyway. So it was this would be a great thing if this existed.
so we thought we'd just make one. And so yeah, that was back in 2017 we started doing that. And then we recorded them in person for a while, for like a few months, but then Ben moved on to pastures new. He finished his masters. We were separate, and then we just started doing it online, and we've carried it on for 6 years, maybe even 7 years now. I'm not very good with the years, but yeah, 7 years, I think.
A number of years greater than 5.
Yeah.
Scotty, my memory is terrible as well. I don't remember what I did last week. Ellie reminds me of things that happened in years past. I'm like, was I there? And she was like, well, it was about you. And I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, I totally get not remembering dates and stuff. So you started that, and obviously you're about herpetology, and it's very like higher end. Did you worry about like finding the audience to listen to that sort of thing, or would you expect it would to be like your peers that would listen, or people that are studying herpetology that would listen?
At the time, I think we just like weren't too bothered about listenership. I mean, I remember looking at our stats and getting like 10 listens and being like, oh wow, 10 people listen to this. Cool. And then, I think yeah, I mean, I guess the listenership is modest, but we hear from listeners, which is really great. And we've had the opportunity to meet quite a few listeners at like conferences and stuff. So I think at the time, at least from my perspective, I wasn't overly concerned about the listenership in terms of who the audience was going to be. I kind of thought, they say podcasts are supposed to be niche, so let's do a niche podcast and make it super niche. And yeah, I think in terms of who we thought the audience would be, I think it's kind of worked out who I envisaged it being. It tends to be mostly like keen high school students, college students, and then just like older people who are interested in science. But I think with any like scientific podcast, I think a lot of people are just interested in science. Like every now and again, I'll listen to a podcast about physics just to be like, wow, physics is kind of crazy. And I think that a lot of people have an interest in just like science broadly. It's just a case of getting it in front of people to an extent.
And making it a little bit more digestible, getting over that hump. Like a scientific paper to an article about a scientific paper is a big, there's a lot of extra info that you don't really, even when I'm sort of reading stuff outside of, uh, my field, I will skip over the vast majority of things and just get to the sort of the meat of it when it comes to conclusions and things. So I think helping bridge that gap can, just open up the audience a little bit more to slightly less specialist folk, I would say.
Yeah, because that was always the intention as well, was that we
Right.
would take scientific research and be a bit like Ben says, like kind of a conduit to make it more accessible because like reading papers isn't always fun. I mean, some of the ones we agree to do, we don't really check them out properly. And then you sit down to do it and you're there like, oh my God, like trying to get through, trying to understand
Quite
methods
dense.
enough that you can sort of like make it simple for someone else is sometimes a real challenge. And so we kind of intended to set out and do that and make things a bit more interesting and fun than maybe, a scientific paper would be in its pure form. And also give people access to it because paywalls are on the vast
Hmm.
majority of papers. Open access publishing is becoming more widespread, but the onus falls on the authors themselves to pay for that, which is like not feasible for most people, particularly in like developing economies and stuff. So we were like, yeah, let's try and make these research papers accessible to absolutely everyone. It doesn't matter who you are in on the earth, you can get something out of these new papers. So that was always the intention.
You find as well that like you have to develop a new skill set of taking ideas that you just know, and then you have to like condense it into something that's really simple to explain it. And that mindset of like some people really struggle with explaining it to a beginner because they explain it as if you should already know, as if you're already a peer. And I think that's quite difficult. And that was one of the big hurdles that we had with this channel, being a science heavy channel, was trying to condense heavy topics or like physics into something really simple and digestible.
Yeah, yeah. And made even harder when you're trying to be kind of a jack of all trades with science as well, because it's just like, yeah, you can't possibly be a specialist in everything. And yeah, you're like you say, I think explaining things to people in a simple way is one of the hardest things you can do, really. Yeah, it is hard.
I don't know. It comes up though. I think it's sort of evergreen because it's not necessarily a simple way. It's a clear way, right? And I certainly
Mm.
feel like practicing that through the podcast has come up in like my own scientific writing and stuff like that. Just sort of committing to something that might sound, simple. I would say would sound clear, but sort of uh, getting rid of that baggage of having to sound like you fit in a little bit more and just committing to saying what you are trying to say, and that's certainly been helpful for me at least.
Have you noticed with your writing that when you first started, you felt like you need to prove yourself, so your writing style was like theatrical and stuff, and nowadays you're like, yeah, bang it as it is on the table. You just say it simple and you don't care anymore. Yeah, definitely. Like same when the last paper I wrote, like it's so straightforward compared to like how I would write previously because of just how we do it on with teaching people daily on with the reptile care. It's so funny how it does that. When you're reading a paper, you mentioned that you like get to the meat of it. What's the most common thing that you skip? Which section of a paper?
I think we'll have different answers for this because our brains work in very different ways, I've come to realize. For me, I just tend to read the introduction to get a feel of what's going on. And then results are important, so I will gloss over those to get a feel for it, but then I'll go to the discussion to see what the authors feel is the most important stuff.
Yeah, that's funny. That might actually be the exact opposite of what I do.
This
Um,
is what I thought you were going to say,
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, first thing I go to is figures because I'm such a visual person. If you can hook me in with some good figures, if you can explain the results through figures, because usually it will go figures, probably then results. Yeah, I would say discussion is probably the bit I'm most willing to sort of chop out, that or intro, straight up. Yeah. almost the exact opposite of you, Tom.
Yeah,
Which is probably a good thing. That probably means we meet in the middle.
yeah, I realized this a while ago that we do this very differently, and I think it is a good thing because, yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the podcast, I'm usually thinking more about the story we're going to tell, and you're thinking more about the like fundamentals of what the thing is, and I think that's the sort of dynamic that works quite well.
So it's not stat analysis. Or was that not even a consideration?
Yeah, I think that
Depends
all
on the
comes under the
paper.
results. Yeah,
Like if it's some phylogenetics thing, I will skip over that. Certainly the stats side of it because I'm out of my depth. Um, but if it's something that I have a passing knowledge of the stats, I will touch on it because it's like there's always ideas that you can nab for your own work too. There have been a
Mhm.
couple of papers that we've covered on the podcast, which I probably never would have read in my own, in the process of doing my own work, but they have highlighted different methods or different analyses, which I have now used. And yeah, so you never know when you're going to find some sort of nugget or something useful. So I don't disregard it, that's for sure.
You love the stats, don't you, Ellie?
Yeah, for someone who really doesn't like numbers, I don't know why, but stats is something that just is really fascinating to me.
that's really good. That's a really good attribute to have.
I'm more like, are the p-values, yeah, is it good, great, is it significant, okay, cool. For the most part, if it's really heavy stats, I'm like, yeah, eyeball it, yeah, move on. But if it's something like you're familiar with, like Ben said, I'm like, yeah, I'll read it. But for the most part, I'm like, make sure it's all there, make sure it looks good, and then I'm okay with it. For the most part, I'm just like, what are you talking about? Some of them are so hardcore.
I do find discussions quite interesting because you can kind of like gauge a sense of what the author's like. Because there's some papers that you've read, you've like looked at the methods, looked at the results, you're like, okay. And then the discussion is just completely wild. They've like pulled like their opinions from something that definitely wasn't discussed in the paper. And you're like, how have you come to that? So
Yeah.
yeah, I find discussions quite fascinating for yeah, that kind of reason.
Yeah, you definitely get that sometimes. And sometimes you can see where people have just sort of like decided later to drag in some sort of like quite topical, but maybe a
Yeah.
little tenuous argument. And you're like, yeah, cool. I guess dinosaurs are kind of related to this. Mm.
Yeah, we run something that we call Journal Club on our Patreon, where we get like a Zoom call like this with our patrons. And then what I will do is I'll take a paper and I'll download the PDF, and I will like blank out like the discussion and abstract and conclusion and things that are like author interpretations, and I'll put it out for them just to read the bare bones of what it actually is, and then we'll chat about it and get their interpretations of what the results and stuff might mean, or the methodology, and then I'll give them the author's interpretations and give them the full like visual. And so many times they've been like, what is the author talking about? I didn't get anything from that. The last one we did was about hognose snakes, and they put them in different enclosures and they were doing preference testing, and they had their air temperature quite high, but they only measured things for using a temperature gun and surface temperature. So they never actually measured the air temperature. But they were studying the Western hognose, and they cited a paper from the Eastern hognose. I'm like, therefore, these temperatures are what the species would have in the wild. And we're like, that's a different species. It's a different part of the US. And there was a part of it was like, they'd botched the methodology, in our opinion anyway, and then they said, therefore, we have found that burrowing snake species prefer cooler air temperatures. And I'm like, we were like, no, you found in your experiment the hognoses preferred the cooler temperatures. To take that to mean all burrowing species is such a massive jump in a discussion. It's crazy.
Kind
Yeah.
of a classic, the overstepping the generalizability of a study, though. I think that's probably why I avoid discussions until the end, is that sort of not wanting to over egg it. But I do sympathize with authors, obviously, because there is that pressure of needing, you've got to get it out the door somehow, and sometimes a little bit of a twist of wording in the discussion or intro to get it out for the sake, because maybe your example less so, but when you've got solid methods, you've got solid results, and all it needs is a little bit of sort of massaging
Space.
intro and discussion, the least worst bit to do it in is the intro and the discussion because that is so interpretive and it's so sort of uh, people reading it know that the intro and the discussion are going to be the more sort of subjective framing aspects. So if you're going to have to make compromises to get it through a journal system or a reviewer or a co-author or whoever, that's I'm more forgiving in those areas for things overstepping, I think.
Well said. Backstepping a little bit after all the heavy science talk, what made you both pick herpetology specifically?
I don't know if I really picked it, to be honest. So I did well, actually we both did degrees in geography, didn't we? Straight out of undergrad, I saw the advertised position for King Cobra tracker, radio telemetry technician, whatever the term was. Went for it, got it, and that was that. I was like, okay, I'm in herpetology world now. All I knew, what I wanted to do was something animal conservation related, or at least animal science related, and yeah, it's just sort of building on one. I got lucky at the beginning, but each sort of subsequent step I've taken has been building on the previous one. So that initial getting that position was sort of instrumental to setting me off on that path, and it's been the same ever since. So I guess luck to a certain extent, and yeah, just sort of liking any animal, regardless.
Yeah, mine's probably the more sort of traditional route that people who are interested in reptiles and amphibians sort of take. Like when I was about 7, I went to a garden centre with my grandparents and they had a corn snake there, or it was like out for kids to hold, and they put it around my neck. And since that moment in time, I've been completely obsessed with snakes, basically. So yeah, I wanted to be a herpetologist when I was 7. Basically, as soon as I found out that dinosaurs are extinct, next best thing, reptiles, lizards are pretty sweet, they're pretty close, although, not necessarily phylogenetically, but they look like dinosaurs. And so, yeah, then after that, I just badgered my parents until got a pet corn snake when I was 10. And then, yeah, just the kind of obsession continued throughout my teenage years. I did kind of I went off to uni and stuff and like found other interests, got really into like music and hanging out with my friends and kind of moved away from reptiles a little bit. While I was at university doing my undergraduate, my mum looked after all my pet snakes because she's a saint. And so yeah, but then after university, I was kind of like wondering what I was going to do, and my partner did a master's in oceanography, and like I was never the best student when I was younger, particularly when I was at school, and then even in undergrad, I was like not the most mature individual, so I didn't necessarily excel. I did fine, but it wasn't like great. And so I saw Maya, my partner, doing this master's in oceanography, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. At this point, I was about 25, so I think I'd finally sort of reached emotional maturity, and I decided to go back to uni and do a master's in ecology. So did that at Exeter University, and then kind of while I was doing that, I got involved with a research project on chameleons and color change, which was really cool and kind of opened the door into herpetology. And then similar to Ben, I saw an advert for this position in Thailand, green pit viper tracking, which I got, went out there and did that. And then, yeah, from that point on, I think mixing with actual herpetologists in the field, Colin Strine is the guy who ran that, seeing that he'd kind of built a career out of this stuff. It was like, yeah, I reckon that's probably what I'll try and do. So a little bit circuitous, really, going from a geography degree, eventually all the way back round to my love of snakes. But yeah, I'm a herpetologist slash birdologist slash a little bit fishologist these days. So yeah.
Just an ologist.
Yeah, well, yeah, spatial ecologist, I think. But yeah, I do. I'll study anything really. You can't always afford to be totally selective in academia.
That's exactly it, isn't it?
Kind of
Yeah,
have
and
to roll with
sometimes
the
the best
punches.
opportunities might not be with your particular chosen species. Yeah.
So you say you had a lot of snakes. What did you have?
I still have some snakes. So I never had loads, but like had a couple of corn snakes first. I only lost the oldest one of that. I lost the second one only like 4 years ago. So she was old. Like she must have been like 17, 18. I've still got the boa constrictor that I got for my 13th birthday. Bam. He's now 20 years old and he's massive. I keep Candoya pulsini, the Solomon Island ground boas. Got a pair of those.
I like
Um,
those.
yeah, they're just really cool snakes. They're mini boas that like
That angular head is so cool.
yeah, and the keeled scales as well is crazy. They just feel like no other snake. Um, well, I suppose they feel like water snakes really, but yeah, they're pretty wild. And then my partner has a variable king snake. Uh, that's it. Yeah, I had a common boa up until like 2 months ago. I had a big albino common boa, but he died of IBD, crazily, which just was like totally unexpected and really sad. So yeah, just the two Solomon Island ground boas, variable king snake, and big boa constrictor at the moment.
So, is there anything else that you would like to keep, or you just settle what you got?
For me personally, I think right now I'm quite settled. Like I also have an aquarium which I'm getting heavy into. Like I breed bristlenose catfish and cherry shrimp. And honestly, just watching the aquarium is something which I've got super into. I love feeding fish. Um, if I were, I think for snakes, I'm probably like tailing down because like I want to give the snakes I've got a lot of space and they're already like, particularly the boa is massive. So I feel a bit like constrained by that right now.
You
But
mean
also
constricted?
constricted, yeah. Yeah, I've considered getting some dart frogs or like some Nifurus geckos, the stump what are they called, stubtail geckos. But yeah, I don't really want to have anything in my house that eats bugs at the moment. Like I just can't really ally myself with that big sh major paradigm shift. I know it's like not a big deal, but it just seems like a lot of admin to keep bugs and stuff. So yeah, that's where I'm at with the reptile keeping. Kind of just enjoying the ones I've got. I would be probably more likely to get another aquarium with some like weird little plecos or something than other stuff. But yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, I've got like a vampire crab paludarium right next to me. That's really cool. So that's my first like foray into like outside of reptiles, I suppose. I used to keep fish like years ago, but reptiles just took over, and there's no going back now.
Yeah, I got a lot of time for crabs. I think that's a good pet.
Crabs are really cool. There's so many different species of vampire crab as well.
Yeah, they're really interesting. Like, yeah, yeah, crabs I'd be quite tempted by. A friend of mine had a like native UK saltwater aquarium with like stuff that he just collected from rock pools, and he had a load of
That's cool.
shore crabs and anemones, and like he caught like a really cool little like rockfish type thing. It was awesome. A really cool aquarium.
Have you ever kept anything, Ben?
No, I'm not in the herpetoculture sort of side of things at all. I've the closest I've kept is rats. That's it.
Fair enough. Rats are
But
really
no,
cool.
no, they were fun. But far from reptiles and certainly far from amphibians.
I like how your first step in was King Cobra.
Well, this is what I mean. It was just entirely incidental and accidental, and just you just run with the opportunities you've got. So,
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
King
So
Cobra tracking though, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. It's actually a horrible job for people to have to do. I was glad I wasn't part of it. It's really hard.
it's worth it though.
Yeah, it was
Worth
cool.
it.
It was really cool.
Like, I suppose the ultimate question would be whether I would do it again, and probably not in the same way.
Yeah, everyone who worked on the King Cobra team, because the King Cobras are moving around so much, and you've got to like, and also they were being tracked, was it 4 or 5 times a day? So you got to
Oh
manually
yeah.
locate them with this telemetry kit. Um, Everyone who worked on the King Cobra team was sleep deprived and like skeletally thin. Meanwhile, me and Kurt, who were doing the spatial ecology of green pit vipers, so this is like Trimerosaurus macrops and Alba laboris, and they just don't really do anything. So tracking them was a breeze. Half the time, we didn't even need the kit. You just go to the tree where they are and just feel like, oh, there he is. Yep, to see him again. So very different life. We did a lot of surveys looking for more snakes, so we were out and about in the forest at night and stuff. But yeah, a lot less intense effort-wise.
so if you could pick one species for the rest of your career to research, and you were locked in, you couldn't change it, what species would that be?
I'll let Tom go first.
I, for me personally, I think I'd be stuck between two. So if I was just going with my heart, like the species which I think I'm most interested in, which is possibly because I've never seen one, that might ruin it. But the elephant trunk snake, Acrocordus javanicus, like they're so
Good
weird.
choice.
They're so weird, and they're like really widely distributed. So you could probably visit quite a few countries in like South and Southeast Asia. Their ecology is pretty much completely unknown. They're big, so you can track them with big stuff. Yeah, that would probably be my answer. That's my answer if like you know, I'm going with my heart if I really had to pick, but I think I'd probably end up going for something venomous because then you've got the whole venom side of things to research. Because I think if you're going to try and get a life's work out of one animal, you probably want it to have some kind of attributes which permit studying it. So then it would be something venomous, and then it'd be easy choice, Bushmaster.
Nice.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, all right. They're pretty good choices. All right.
This is where Ben just whips out a bird and it's not even a reptile or an amphibian.
No, I would not. I would not do that. That's absolutely not in the spirit of things. No, I went with the combination toad, so Dutaphrynus melanistictus, um, for the sort of tactical reasons that you hinted at there, Tom. Where so super widely distributed, so it gives you lots of opportunities to go and visit different places. It's being introduced all over the place, so potentially opportunity to go back and work in Madagascar that would be awesome. Um, I don't think much has been done on their behavior, and that seems like an absolute gold mine for study. They're just about big enough to radio track, and they're just undeniably charismatic.
That's a bit of you, that isn't it, Ellie?
Yeah, I really like big toads. I don't know. There's just something about them.
Exactly. Yeah. They're
Ben's
just
mad for toads
charming.
as well. Yeah. We saw
Okay,
some nice big Asian spine toads actually in India last year. They're pretty good. Yeah. They're fun.
I mean that kind of leads into my next question was for both of you, reptiles or amphibians?
I mean, I'd never throw shade on amphibians because they're brilliant. Like they're so cool. But for me, it's always been reptiles first. I think, yeah, and particularly snakes. It's always kind of snakes have been the animal which I've been most fascinated by for sure. But, the same with anything. The more I learn about amphibians, the better they get. They've certainly got a lot of cool behaviors. They socialize, they communicate. So, and they're beautiful. So, yeah, no shade, but definitely reptiles and definitely snakes.
Yeah, reptiles too for me, to be honest. Like I know I picked a toad for my for the species, but I don't know. Reptiles, specifically big lizards. I picked the toad because of the wide distribution and sort of gaming the idea of working on one thing for a long time. But I think if I were to pick a sort of group that's always caught me, it would be like big monitor lizards and things like that. Those are my yeah. So reptiles win.
What
I
about
love
you,
me
Ellie?
some toads and some frogs, but
It's a really difficult one. Chameleons are something that I've been obsessed with for a really, really, really long time. But I think at the moment I'm in like an amphibian craze. They're just it's something about them. They're like really archaic, and obviously they haven't really changed. And like Pac-Man frogs, there was like an ancient Pac-Man frogs in like the dinosaur time. Like that's crazy to me. Like they've got like amazing like vocalizations, color changes. I just think yeah, they're amazing. And like even like they have really weird like anatomy. Like for when we want to like focus on something, our lens has changed shape, but they actually like bring their lens forward and back. I just think that's so weird. Like there's nothing about them that's the same as us, really. Yeah, I don't know.
Is that Boezel Bufo? Is that the prehistoric like massive? Yeah, Boezel Bufo or something like that. Yeah, I think mine would be snakes. Yeah, yeah. I think mine would be definitely be snakes. Yeah, I'm with you on snakes. I can never, even though I try to get into like lizards and stuff because I think it's like welfare wise, I think it's so much easier to like allow them to hunt insects and stuff. I'm not doing that for like a rat for a snake, but like I still can't get away from snakes. It's just anytime I think about getting anything else, it's always a snake. I'm just caught on the snakes.
Snakes, there is something about snakes.
So you both studied in Asia then. If you had to pick like a habitat or geographic region that you're most interested across the world, what would that be?
I found this one next to impossible to answer. I can't. This is such a tough question. Um, uh, I think I'd probably go back to Southeast Asia, to be honest. It's kind of captured me. The insane biodiversity there just means that you're always going to be finding something new, pretty much, even if it's not new in terms of this new species sort of thing, but like a new weird behavior or a new sort of weird behavior and a new habitat sort of thing. There's such an incredible density of difference. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't really want to be more specific than that, to be honest, because I think part of the fun of uh what I've done thus far has been sort of dipping in and out of different places and different species and things. So I'm just gonna cop out and just say that this is Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I also had Southeast Asia for similar reasons, but not just Southeast Asia. I also really like Central America. I went to Costa Rica for the first time this year. I'd never been to Central America before, and it was just amazing. Yeah, I think either of those places are good because they've got pit vipers. Anywhere with pit vipers, really. I think, yeah, I can't. I'd like to go to Australia, obviously. Studying stuff there would be neat. Australia does have a lot of its own researchers and things, so you'd kind of have to shuffle in among them, but there's still loads to do. So, yeah, but I think if I had to choose just one, it'd probably be Malaysia, just because it's got the perfect climate, it's got tons of cool snakes. Also, things like make it easy there, like everyone speaks English. They drive on the left-hand side of the road. People can drive really well. So when you drive around, you feel safe. Not that I feel particularly unsafe anywhere, but like it's a different experience than renting a car elsewhere in Asia. So yeah, probably number one, Malaysia.
I love how practical both of your answers are. It's not like, oh, the cloud forests, 'cause they're amazing. It's like, right, they drive on the left and they drive really well. It's amazing.
It has to have snakes first, but then after the snakes, let's talk about the driving standards.
To be fair, I do think that kind of, in a weird way, it kind of works because we're so keen for so many different animals, and you can find cool things about almost any species if you look close enough. The particular study animal can sort of become secondary to making sure you're actually there and able to do some cool research. So at least that's the way I think about it. Anyway, I don't know if that's the same with you, Tom, or you sort of twisting the Malaysia thing because of the good snakes first. But
Yeah, the good snakes are first, but like you say, there's so many cool, and I mean, like the top, like probably 30 pit vipers are virtually indistinguishable in how cool they are. So yeah, after
right.
you've got to think of other reasons. But no, I mean, I can't think of a place in the world I'd turn down doing research. If someone said to me, "Oh, do you want to go to this place? It's going to be really hard, and you're going to have to trek through the jungle for weeks, and you get bitten by mosquitoes," I'd be like, "Yes, let's go tomorrow." It doesn't matter, but if you have your choice, then make
You
my
can
life
soften some of the negatives. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
What is it about pit vipers that you love so much?
I think it's because
They don't move.
they're super sedentary animals, but that's not the main reason. I think the first thing about pit vipers is just how cool they look. Like they look mean, right? They've got like these arrow-shaped heads, elliptical pupils. They just look like intimidating to an extent, and they come in bright colors. Um, they're relatively easy to find compared to other snakes, generally speaking. Not always, but they're usually some of the most abundant if they're small and green and they're in places, so you can tend to see them. Um, yeah, and I think just the fact that they have heat sensing pits in their faces, and that is a sensory mechanism that they can use to hunt. Seeing heat is just incredibly cool. It's very like predator, isn't it? So I think it's hard to get away from that.
Have you ever thought about keeping anything like that?
It's crossed my mind for sure. Like, and I have friends that have like DWA stuff, but like I just feel, yeah, I just can't really justify it. Like, I don't know what the point of that would be for me. Like, I'd have a venomous snake in my house and it would look cool, but it would also just put me and my family in like slightly very mild peril.
Mm.
Albeit very mild. And also, like, I feel like for me at least, snakes are quite a tactile pet. Like, I like to get them out, I like to squeeze them, play with them. Um, a pit viper just completely precludes that. You're only going to be handling it with a hook. But that said, do I think it's cool when I see like an eyelash viper in a massive planted vivarium somewhere? Yeah, that's cool.
I suppose that the sedentary nature would do well for captivity. To be fair, not like a king cobra. That'd be quite a struggle.
Yeah,
Yes, keep a tiger in a basement, sort of thing. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think they are generally pretty sedentary. So yeah, I think from a welfare perspective, they're probably better than most. You know, they will move when the need arises, but yeah, they do tend to be pretty stationary. I mean, some of the snakes, some of the white-lipped pit vipers and big-eyed pit vipers we were tracking would just come out at night. You'd see them, they'd be doing their little S-bend thing, looking at stick, and then you'd go back in the day, they'd be in their little log hollow to, maybe a meter, 2 meters away from that. And then you'd come back the subsequent night and they'd be on the log, not only in the same position, but in the same exact orientation. So every coil of their body would be identical to where it had been the night before. Why? I don't know. Why is it so essential that the snake is coiled in that exact pose? But often that was the case. So yeah, they are very much sedentary creatures.
Sounds quite ideal. Apart from the venom.
Yeah, the venom, and also I think pit viper bites hurt. So yeah, obviously just don't get bitten would be the answer to that.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, I mean that sort of stuff is just a bit next level for me personally. Although I did get like rear fang stuff recently, so I'm like, ooh, venom.
What kind of rear fang snakes are we talking?
Samnophis shikari.
Okay, yeah. They're like they're like really speedy collyrid type things, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. They're quite fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what they look like. They're kind of does it look like a mini Malpolon snake?
Yes, yeah. You're very very close related.
They're grey.
They're like sandy beigey color.
Cool. Well, they sound really nice.
With the big eyes, and they're social, so they'll like choose to go like sit with each other and stuff. So you just look over and they'll be up like watching you. So they're just really cool.
Oh, they sound really nice.
Yeah. So going back to obviously your research in herpetology and your interest in herpetology, what would you think that someone might expect, like if they were to go and study herpetology?
I mean, from my perspective, I think there's a lot more to it. Like just biology in general, it's not just like field work and stuff that's like, sort of fun and outdoorsy. What you learn quite quickly is that you have to do a lot of other stuff. It's like Ellie was alluding to. You got to kind of do a bit of stats. There's a lot of admin as well in being a herpetologist. Like you got to organize everything yourself, organize your trips, organize your fieldwork equipment, work out how equipment works. Like right now, I work with transmitters mostly. So a lot of my work is to do with putting tags on animals and then subsequently tracking them, trying to find out where they go. Same for Ben. And like one of the most difficult things I find is like getting new technology and trying to make it work. It just takes days and days of your time when you think you'd just be like, haha, yeah, today I'm going to write a paper about whatever animal it might be. But before that, you have to do all this like at the minute, I'm sort of network engineering systems that are like meant for CCTV to track GPS of animals, and it's like ongoing saga for days and days. So there's definitely a lot of sort of skills that you need, and particularly around like stats and like coding and that kind of stuff. Like you don't have to be amazing, but you have to have some ability realistically. And I think certainly in our supervisors' days, there might have been someone in the unit who was like a statistician or a mathematician who could take your data and then give you some numbers to put in your paper, and you didn't have to really concern yourself with it. But those days are long gone. Now you kind of have to be you have to do all those things yourself and kind of be a bit of a jack of all trades, which isn't insurmountable, but it's definitely something to be aware of before you kind of get into it.
I think that's a really good answer. Yeah, jack of all trades stuff. Yeah, because it doesn't even stop at the sort of hardcore sciencey things. You know, you're presenting, you're communicating, you all those sort of I suppose what would be called soft skills, although that's a little bit unfair to them because some of them require some genuine, equivalent effort to what you would call hard skills. Um, yeah, writing stuff. I think writing is a big one. Getting rapid at writing and sort of unprecious with it, I think helps massively. Um, I mean, my day in, day out is, well, for the past however many years now, 3 years has been coding and writing and nothing else in between. So, am I still doing herpetology? I mean, I suppose I'm working with snake data for a portion of it, but like, I haven't, I don't have a study animal at this point. Um, so if you want to stretch the definition of herpetology, then the sort of balance between practical reptile and amphibian stuff versus the academic stuff Tom was just describing skews very heavily towards the paper pushing.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say as well is that people just tell you no so much. Like you really have to get a bit of a thick skin, which like I struggled with it because criticism to me is like bullets. So I was like, you write a grant, it's like the best idea you've ever had. You're so in it. It's like this is going to be great. We're going to get this money and then we're going to do this cool science. And then you get the feedback and it's like, nah, your idea is actually bad. You're just like, okay,
And you
cool.
should feel bad.
Yeah, or like you'll work for months and months on some paper. This happened to me for my PhD papers. And I mean, like, it is what it is, but sometimes you have an idea of what your thing is, and then you send it to a publication and they just reject it. And it's not because it's bad work, it's just because they're looking for something more specific or more applicable, like we were talking about earlier. And so then you kind of have to reevaluate. And I think that you get better with that side of it over time, like understanding where to pitch stuff. But grant rejections and like harsh reviews, that kind of stuff, like there is a lot of those things coming in which you just have to develop a thick skin against.
So any 14-year-olds out there that are like, oh, I want to be a herpetologist is not just running through the forest chasing king cobras.
There can be a lot of that though, so don't lose hope. Like you can have that. And also, you only have to have at least for me for my work at the minute, I'm kind of doing field work probably on average like 1 day a week. And those 1 day a weeks, they count for a lot. It's like really nice to get out and do stuff. Whatever it might be. So, yeah, that's not always the case, but yeah, and I certainly wouldn't want to put anyone off, but the reality is that, yeah, you do have to do a lot of other stuff, which isn't generally, I wouldn't necessarily say it makes it bad. I still love doing science. There's nothing else I want to be doing. It's just that, you kind of, there is a job to it as well at some level.
And it tends to open, you get better at certain skills and it tends to open opportunities in others, right? Like it's I think sort of over specializing too early is probably something to be warded against.
Yeah. Yeah. It's probably not the best approach to be like, I'm going to be an expert in, let's say, let's say elephant trunk snakes, maybe you love elephant trunk snakes, they're your absolute passion, but like realistically, the likelihood of being able to study them at a master's PhD level is probably quite slim unless you can whip up a miracle finding your own funding. So you kind of have to be flexible. The better approach is to probably try and specialize in a methodology or an approach or some other thing, which you can then subsequently start to apply to animals that you're really interested in.
Yeah, I mean, did you find that you first started being taught like formally and you were like, oh, this writing stuff and the referencing, oh, I hate this, it's such a burden. And then you found that you learned to love it, or do you still hate it?
So for me, whenever I have to do something that I don't like, it's an incredible motivator for doing it more efficiently and therefore not having to ever do it again. So I think this is where my sort of quite enjoy the sort of coding aspect of things because that's your ultimate tool set for avoiding doing repetitive, boring work. And if you can get good at that, you can make the machine do everything. So that's been my response to it is not necessarily growing to love it, but growing to come up with better and better ways of avoiding it, and that's been quite satisfying, I think. And that I do quite enjoy. Any sort of efficiency gains, I love that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, writing and referencing for me, like, I don't know. I find writing quite fun sometimes. It does depend what you're writing to some extent, but yeah, and then referencing gets a lot easier once you have a good referencing software, but it's always going to be a bit of a pain, really. Like, it never fully works exactly as you anticipate, and there's always a bit of fiddling around. And then if you're, where you're sending stuff, they have opinions on how things should be formatted too. So it can end up being a bit of a pain, but yeah, it's just one of those things.
Yeah. Do you think that most people that go through higher education learn to love the science side of it like that, or do you think that most people are still like, ugh?
I wouldn't call that the science side. I'd call that academia. And I think that's the separation I make because the sort of science to me is a systematic learning of stuff and the sort of referencing and the putting it in the right shape and getting in the right place and all that I just all lump into academia. And if I'm being not mincing my words, I think academia needs massive improvements in pretty much every possible way because there is so much time wasted. And the referencing stuff, it's not complicated, but does it waste time? Absolutely. Is it necessary? Absolutely also, but the way we've got things set up is just an absolute botch, to be honest. And you can somewhat mitigate it, but I don't know. It needs to be cleaned up.
So we've got areas in academia lacking. Do you also think that there's area in herpetology or areas of research in herpetology that are really lacking?
Areas in what way? Like the how it's conducted, or the like spaces in terms of what's being studied?
Both. I mean, I'm interested in you answering both now, actually.
Process wise, yeah, I could talk about like process stuff till the cows come home. I've written chunks on sort of open science practices and that needing to be better in herpetology, and it has massively improved. Um, but I think there's a lot of again, it's just this sort of old academic baggage, like a journal and articles and all of that is very, very old. And if you were to come up with a fresh way to, it's like the car thing, right? If you would introduce a car today, people would be like, no, it's ridiculous, it's way too dangerous. But if you have that momentum, you can get stuck in these sort of ruts. And I do feel the publishing system is pretty much that. Because if you tried to come up with a fresh system now, I don't think you would come up with this weird send it off to two peer reviewers, journal gatekeeping sort of system. I think it would be a lot more dynamic and a lot more um, flexible. So anything that's sort of pushing closer to what I see as being more open-ended and more flexible, I'd love to see. I mean, there's a whole push with sort of preprints and that sort of pre-peer review way of going about it. The sort of community peer review stuff is growing and growing. There's a whole space of sort of academic literature which is going towards these sort of living documents. So instead of having this like concrete, yes, okay, this is a published version, this is this is what this piece of data says, end of, and anything sort of subsequent has to be sort of new additions. You can have something that's sort of more version controlled and sort of can evolve over time. You can go back and reapply analysis if things change. So I think that's something I would love to see herpetology sort of embrace more formally, I suppose, because I do think a lot of herpetological specific journals are a little bit not behind the times. I mean, a lot of them are actually much better than other places, but it's more academia in general. It's just, we can do better. We can keep pushing in this direction. So yeah, I don't know if that was a very coherent answer, but this getting rid of some of the more rigid systems in academia probably would be beneficial.
And what about areas of research, of areas of study, like what species and things like that?
Oh, I just want to see more behavioral stuff like intelligence, cognitive ability stuff. I always find that massively fascinating. I know there's some really, really good stuff being done, um, but I think it's one of those tricky things to tackle, certainly like snakes and stuff, when you're dealing with potentially a less food motivated group. Because there's been some incredible stuff done with birds and mammals and things. Bringing that into the snake and sort of reptile world more would be brilliant. But also, big one, fossorial animals. What's going on with them? You can't even see them under there. So if there was some sort of silver bullet to track the movements and behavior of fossorial animals, I would like to hear about it.
What about you, Tom?
Wow, they're both really good answers. Yeah. Well, we always bang on about how natural history observations are also just lacking. Like we just don't really know what most animals even broadly do, even when it's like a big deal thing, like what they're eating or when they're mating. We just don't really know. I think, yeah, what did you say, Ben, for soil animals? Um, yeah, I think just like I mean, I'm still always interested in just like basic ecology stuff, like where do things go? What do they do? What is the life of an animal actually like? So I think that we pretty much don't know that for like 90% of all reptile and amphibian species. So yeah, anything to do with that vein, like lifestyles and yeah, I guess that kind of falls broadly under behavioral ecology, but not so much necessarily to do with cognition, but just more about like what is their daily business? What do they actually get up to? I always find those papers really interesting. And I think there are certainly areas like geographically which receive a lot less attention. If you look at scientific research and where it originates from. There's a massive glut from Europe, there's a massive glut from America, and there's a massive glut from Australia. And really, everywhere else is kind of like, and China, to be fair, does a lot too, but we don't always have access to those papers. Um, so I think, yeah, there's a big gap in places like, like Papua, um, Africa, like, like Central Africa, really, the Middle East. Although, there are good scientists in all those places, but yeah, their reptiles are definitely dramatically understudied compared to ones in the kind of global North and Australia.
And there tends to be more of them there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's so funny to me. Like we have like this massively reduced like reptile assemblage in Europe, but every single one of those species has been so studied, and we're still studying them more. Like I'm studying smooth snakes and adders right now. Like we're not going to stop. But there are so many species who we could apply these to in other countries that we just don't have either the contacts or the wherewithal, be it monetary or permit wise, to go ahead and do these things in other places.
You want to ask anything, Ellie? I feel like I'm just taking over, so I'm leaving pauses for you, but I just don't want to take over. She's just thinking. You okay?
Yeah. Whilst you're out in the field, do you ever collect field data such as temperature, UVI, or anything like that that we could kind of like use in the like the pet trade and things like that?
So I've collected temperature data for sure, and a lot of the transmitters we use also collect temperature, um, which would I imagine be quite interesting for keeping stuff because you can see where they're actually selecting to be at. In terms of like other things, I've never collected anything to do with light levels. A lot of that kind of stuff, if I need it, there are like databases, but it won't be on the kind of level of microhabitat that like would interest herpetoculture realistically, probably. It's more like there's databases where you can look at like whatever rainfall on that day, temperature on that day. You can look at moon phase when it became dark, and all of those things are online for you to just draw upon. So I've kind of tended to rely on stuff that's in online databases and then just record temperature. But like I feel like those things wouldn't be that hard to record. If you wanted to stick some tags on me, then I'd be happy to.
I
There's
think
so
that's what
much you
the
could do.
issue. Sorry, the issue we had with the Kings was that we were picking up taking temperature readings in something that was representative of where the snake was, but I'm not sure if that was ever sort of formally used in any publication because it was really hard to be confident in any of it because you're trying to recreate the microhabitat of a snake that's X number of meters away that you're pretty sure you know where it is, but you don't know if it's in a hole, if it's sitting on top of just under a bush in a hole, under a rock. So it sort of led to this not having a good way of taking reliable temperature data, and therefore it's sort of being deprioritized because anything you're collecting in the field takes effort. And if you've only got so much effort to to use, if it's not sort of pertinent to the question, it does tend to get bumped down the order of priorities.
Fair enough. I think like things like if it's lizards that are like heliothermic and diurnal, like to see one basking and they'll be like, oh, what's it basking at? And then like measure the sunlight in that exact moment. I think that's easier. But like you said, like when things like, is it in a hole? Is it not? I think I could definitely see how that would be like really difficult. Do you think there's any ideas in herpetology that are like outdated?
Not like I don't know. The thing is with any science, it's kind of constantly shifting and evolving. I wouldn't want to call out like any individual ideas, which I think
Call
are
them out, Tom.
well, mainly because I'd struggle. Like I feel like most people are on the case. Like if you do something which is like perceived as old, people will like comment on that. But for me, I think personally, something which comes up again and again is naming things after people. To me, seems really archaic now. And I love talking about this
That's
because it
fair.
is quite controversial. Because some people love it, like the old guard. Some people love it, and I respect their thoughts. They can like it, but yeah, I just think naming things after celebrities is just sycophantic and weird. And I just don't understand why we need to name things after like old explorers anymore. It's just like it's just not my vibe. I feel like also as someone who's like constantly trying to remember new names, it's so hard to remember if it's just some mate's name, like especially if it's like not like there's a there's a species of is it Lycodon? It's like one of the Asian colubrids. I think it's Lycodon. No, it might be Oligodon. It's Oligodon Zeus Victoriae, which is named after Zeus Victoria. And it's like, yeah, cool. I get that they've done loads of good work, but like that name sucks and it's so hard to remember. It's like, what's that snake? Oh yeah, Oligodon Zeus. What? No. Might not even be an Oligodon, but that to me is like it won't stay in my mind, and that really annoys me. Like if you'd named it something which is like some ancient Greek for something to do with the patination or some feature of the snake or where it's from. So you're like, oh, okay, I found a Oligodon. I'm in this forest. It's such and such forest A or whatever, that's easy to remember. So yeah, I always have a bit of a gripe with that. It just kind of makes herpetology feel like a bit of an old boys club to me, which it definitely isn't. So yeah.
I think also it makes it really confusing when the name comes up multiple times in different taxonomic groups. So are they like related? Are they not? Are they on the same continent? It makes it really difficult.
That's such a good point. Yeah, like some of the old naturalists like Boulanger have got so many things named after them. Yeah, I've not thought about that. That's so true. That is really annoying.
What do you think, Ben?
I mean, that's such a strong answer. I'm tempted just to double down on it. Because I don't have anything better to be honest. Because I think Tom's sort of initial point that stuff, herpetology is changing. It's changing quite rapidly. Even my sort of diatribe about sort of journal and publishing stuff. It's all moving forward. It's all very dynamic, and I think there's so many sort of new folk coming in that aren't necessarily sort of burdened by I don't know the sort of past ideas. It's probably going to speed up in terms of the way it adapts, and so I'm almost not less concerned about it because it's not going to stay outdated for long, I guess. So optimism.
Just a quick one. If you're someone that's enjoying this episode and you're loving the nerdy level of detail in it, I would like to promote our Patreon. Now, on our Patreon, we're doing Journal Club, where we join into a Zoom call and we all read a paper together and discuss it and disseminate and build our skill sets in digesting and disseminating papers together. We have our Advanced Keeper Chats, where we will join on another call and talk about an advanced topic for an hour or two. I'm also building courses on the Patreon, which means it will put you in the top 1% of understanding of animal welfare science in herpetoculture. And really, it's so cheap for what it is. So if you're interested in that, the links will be down below. Go check it out. Hang out with us on Patreon. Back to the episode. I think going back to about the naming convention, the thing that I don't like is the modern version of it is like naming it after like Sonic the Hedgehog or some cartoon. Or I hate that. I hate it.
Yeah,
pop culture reference stuff. Yeah.
Pop culture is like inherently like transient.
Fleeting.
Right? It's like we care about Sonic, but like our grandkids are not going to probably know what Sonic is. Maybe like it's probably 50-50 our grandkids will heard of Sonic, and by their grandkids it's like probably 5%. So generations to come are going to have these species named after things, and then they're going to have to become like archaeologists and historians just to understand the origins of the names. That is really it's really stupid.
Jack of all trades, mate. Just add it to the
add it to the list.
Yeah, there was an ancient people here who I think they worshipped a blue hedgehog. It's like
I think they worshipped a blue hedgehog. That's tickled me. Yeah. So what recent study that you've read was the most impactful to you?
So this is like another bit of a controversial one really, but there was a study that came out recently which was about pheasants reducing the amount of reptile biodiversity in the local area where they inhabit. It came from Belgium, and I don't know. Pheasants have been like a bit of a gripe of mine for quite a while now, where I just don't understand the industry really, because we release like 50 million birds. They become the single largest bird by biomass in the UK, and it's so like a tiny proportion of people can shoot them for fun. And like, I know people say it's a sort of countryside living and whatever, and people will maintain the land for that use. But I just don't understand how we allow it, given the damage it definitely will be causing to our native biodiversity. And we already have like such an incredibly depleted, like insect numbers this year are like, you just don't really see bugs that much. And yet we still think it's okay to release these, large meso predators in numbers exceeding, in millions, and they're just going around the countryside killing eating absolutely everything they can fit in their beaks. So, yeah, that paper kind of lent a lot of credence to arguments you hear quite a lot of people making. So for me, that was quite a big one in terms of kind of, yeah, just sort of reaffirming my belief that like the rearing and releasing of pheasants is something really archaic. It's not even archaic. It started in the 70s. I just don't understand why we're still doing it.
It's a
Mental.
it's a new modern mistake.
Yeah, it's a modern mistake that people are like, oh, it's our whole like way of life. It's like, yeah, but only recently, just do something else, same as every other industry that is realized to be massively archaic. Like, we're not going in mines just for fun anymore. Like, just change it. So yeah, that doesn't go for all industries, obviously, but I do think that that one is something which is really, given the evidence of the damage it causes, should probably go.
What about you, Ben?
So I'm going to completely switch gear and be not very herpetological about it, unfortunately. So basically, my PhD is all focusing on a lot of methodological questions. So basically, the paper that's had the most influence is going to be one that's tied into that, and it's this. The title is the case for formal methodological science. Sorry, the case for formal methodology in scientific reform. Sounds really, really dry, and I suppose if you don't care, it is. But the crux of it is examining the sort of statistical side of some of these assertions that we make in science about sort of reproducibility and replication, where we have this idea that replication means that science, if a study can be replicated and reproduced, it must be a better proxy for truth. And basically, this paper is going through and sort of statistically breaking down that that's not necessarily the case, and that to actually determine whether a study is better or worse, and is whether it's getting us closer to what we actually want, this idea of truth or true effect, is a lot more complicated and requires a lot more sort of methodological rigor to get there. And it's just this really nice. It's kept me honest with the way that I'm sort of doing things, because it's a very easy space to slip into of, if you can do the same study again and again and again in different places and they all agree, that must be that you're looking into something true. And that's not the case, because all of those studies could have some fundamental, like a model misspecification or something to do with measurement error, or just conceptualizing the system incorrectly or something like that. And therefore, all you can do is you're just reproducing the same incorrect answer, and actually the way forward would be to reassess. So yeah, that's my one. It's as I say, it's pretty heavy stats, but I recommend people reading it, because even if you get sort of only a 2 or 3 points out of it, like probably I have, they keep you second guessing things in a sort of constructive way.
That kind of like leads on to our next question, which is your like favorite study recently that has disproved another study previously? Does that make sense?
I can lead straight off what I was
Yeah, go on, Ben.
saying. So the one I've that always comes to mind for me is, we covered it on the podcast, and it was this estimating encounter rates in brown anoles. Yeah, I think it was brown anoles. And it was basically getting at this idea that, well, basically what they showed in the paper was that males had multiple mates, but also females had multiple mates. And it essentially undermined this idea of this strict territorial system that brown anoles had sort of been put in up until that point. And I basically the paper really did a good job for me. I think about it all the time. It comes up again and again. It's like, this is the point that did a better job at recognizing how you think about a system, how you conceptualize a system can shape how you're asking questions about that system. So they, and there were a couple of papers after it, sort of highlight that if you think about animal territoriality in sort of like a land ownership sort of way, you might end up blinding yourself to completely different bits of behavior and dynamics in their system, which was the female mate choice essentially in this case, where it was so sort of focused on the male mate choice and the territoriality, and it been going on so long that there was so much momentum behind that way of thinking that an entire sort of half of the population had been neglected, and actually examining that completely overturned how you should think about it, and it suddenly was explained through all this sort of genetic and behavioral evidence. So, okay, they're not polygynous. There's actually what is it, polygandry with multiple female and male mates. And
Monogamy is one.
yeah,
So were they monogamous or
they were polygynous.
They
So
were.
males with multiple female. The idea was it was males with multiple females, so they would hold a territory, and females would. Sorry, they would hold a territory that overlapped with multiple females. But the truth of the matter was, the females also had multiple mates because there were males that were not holding territories necessarily. It's sort of like the sneaky cuttlefish thing. There were males that were sort of less, you know, locking down a territory and sort of being a bit more flexible. But also you had territorial bits of territorial overlap as well. So yeah, that brown animals and their territoriality, that's my one. I absolutely love that paper and the sort of subsequent soul searching that it's sort of prompted afterwards.
I'll follow that one up, Tom.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer to that one, to be fair. I couldn't think of anything that sort of proved a previous study wrong. I do think it's interesting though, Ben, you talk about like sort of sexual systems and how we get entrenched in thinking about them, because for ages humans thought that loads of birds were monogamous, but actually like the vast majority of them just like have extra partner like relations with other birds like all the time. It happens. And I think the same was true of deer, wasn't it? They thought deer were monogamous for a bit, and then it turns out that they're absolutely not. So yeah. Um
Yeah,
also
it's hard to break yourself out of things that you take for granted. Like you just have ways, even words of describing things can shape how you conceptualize them and how you ask questions of them. So
yeah, that's introductions and discussions, entrenching these ideas again. Yeah.
Well, a little bit. If you use the word territoriality, you have a concept in mind. If you never mention territoriality but talk about like mate selection, you may never sort of come up, tackle this bit of whether they have a defined territory or not. And it's actually just you're talking about encounter rates, not sort of spatial setup and land use, space use.
Yeah, I guess in this vein as well, something which was discovered, I think, last year is that well, probably most female snakes have a clitoris, which was like something that was completely overlooked. And that bit of knowledge has already changed quite a few things, especially because there are species of snake which have been described based on like hemipene morphology, so the male sexual organs, but the hemipene's actually a misidentified clitoris. So they're actually working with female snakes, not male snakes. Someone was telling me about that as a thing. So yeah, I guess that's quite a big change that's happened quite a lot, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, because back in the day when I was at having my masters, I would like went on this real like niche journey about seahorses, and like everyone culturally believed that seahorses were monogamous from this one study back in the 70s from this one scientist in a summer. And actually it turned out that they have really complex like social hierarchies, and it was the most dominant male that got to pick the biggest female, and so they were with the same mate because they were all like ranked on the size of the male. And if you actually took one female out, they would swap, but nobody thought about that. Everyone just thought, oh, okay, so they must be monogamous. And then from then on, like culturally, we all think of them as being monogamous. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, it's mad. How many times has that been written down with that reference? To a point where it's like in all the textbooks,
exactly,
and it becomes gospel. Yeah.
Yes, it's momentum, and it's a shame because it's actually hiding a lot more interesting things going on there, right? Suddenly you've got a much richer understanding of these animals and their lives and the sort of choices they're making.
I mean, there's plenty of things that get cited from, and I find that a lot of people have got quite lazy writing where they will cite something, but they haven't actually gone to follow the trend through or the trail through to the original paper. So they'll cite a citation of a citation of a citation of a different paper, and then they've not gone to the original citation to even see whether they agree with it. Just cited that that is correct. Like there's the statistic that says that 75% of all pet reptiles die. Full stop. And if you actually follow
I
that
assume
through,
100% die if you give it enough time.
well, yes, technically. But if you actually follow it through to go to the original thing, it's a case study of a importer in Texas, and they got raided for like rampant abuse, and it turned out that 75% reptile mortality happened in that case, and someone has, with various intentions, cited that as 75% of reptiles full stop die, and then it's just kind of like gone and become its own thing where people have cited that and not even checked to see whether it's actually true, and they're citing another paper of a paper of a paper, and suddenly it becomes truth when it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Science.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something I expect to see when I'm like marking undergraduate work, but like people should really be trying harder. But yeah, I'm sure that not everyone necessarily all the time does.
Okay, yeah. So the question that I wanted to ask was that many people might be confused about like the blending of herpetoculture and then herpetology. Can you just define the difference between the two for us, please?
Well, yeah, so herpetology is the kind of scientific endeavor of studying reptiles and amphibians, whereas herpetoculture is the keeping of reptiles and amphibians. Um, but yeah, they are different things, but I do think they are also kind of quite linked in many ways. I think certainly in terms of people, in various ways, but I think in terms of people who are herpetologists, most of them are probably herpetoculturists or have been at some point. Um, and yeah, I mean, I personally, I might be preempting your question here, Liam, but I don't have a problem with people who call themselves herpetologists at all. Like, I think if people are like trying to learn more about reptiles and amphibians seriously, it's like, yeah, okay, you're a herpetologist, I guess. Like people who take pictures of photographers, they might not be professional photographers, but like you can still call them a photographer. I think a lot of people who are herpetoculturists, extremely motivated to learn about research and know an awful lot. So I don't think it's necessarily helpful to try and draw a distinction between the two entirely. I think most people who keep reptiles have like an interest in the science behind them too, and vice versa, really.
Interesting. I wasn't expecting you to say that, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I don't think we need to be in like some ivory tower of herpetologists being like, like, I think, yeah, if you're like 9 years old and you're reading every single book you can about snakes, you're like, junior herpetologist, why not?
What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I like that. I like that way of thinking. Yeah, I think that sort of separation that I would draw, other than the sort of reptile keeping is obviously herpetoculture, is thinking about things in a scientific manner. Because I think there's a difference in sort of reading and learning about stuff. Yep, that's fine, but coming at it from a certain point of view, as opposed, it's not just sort of flavor and I don't even know there was not just facts about something, but thinking about it as I don't know, maybe sort of tendencies or sort of thinking about sort of further questions, just that extra bit of maybe it's a slightly more critical mindset or something like it. I'm it's minutiae.
Like the difference between watching like David Attenborough shows and then going and reading ecology papers.
Perhaps a little, but I think even the sort of watching something like your Planet Earth or whatever would be fine if you're then going on to think about the things that you've learned there in a particular way and asking more questions of it. I think it's that seeking knowledge bit which really differentiates it, which I don't know, maybe that is just learning and I'm being obtuse, but it feels like there's something different there. It just feels like there needs to be a little bit sort of that proactiveness with it. But honestly, the label thing doesn't bother me at all. If you feel comfortable using one label and another, then you know that's fine by me. I honestly wouldn't describe myself as a herpetologist mostly because the vast majority of the work I do is broader than herpetology. It could be applied to all sorts of things, and I wouldn't want to preemptively silo myself um, because there's fewer jobs and stuff. If I'm being very practical and cynical about it.
See, I totally respect that, Ben, and like I've kind of found myself doing a job which is mostly not herpetology, but I would always refer to myself as a herpetologist in most situations, in the hopes of doing
Right,
herpetological work because it's also my soul. So yeah,
right, but that's you choosing that. So I think it's
yeah,
almost it's
I
it's a more personal thing than it is you must conform to this set of criteria sort of thing.
yeah. If people
Yeah.
ask me what I do, I just say I'm a biologist because that's like easier. I used to say ecologist, but then people don't know what that means sometimes, and it's just like, it's like sounds a bit up yourself. So better just go biologist.
It's a shame. I like ecologist
I
more.
like ecologist too because it's a bit more specific and I feel like it feels a bit more justified. Like when I say I'm a biologist, I feel like some people are going to be like, "Oh wow, did you cure cancer?" And it's like, "No,
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I was
Yeah.
looking at what the little lizards are doing." Very different, but yeah.
Yeah, we've got a Patreon question now here. Any news on the Aesculapian snake research in the UK?
Yes, so there is some news. So both myself and Ben are authors of a paper about Escalapian snake spatial ecology, which is currently in review. It's available online as a preprint, so if anyone wants to read it, it's completely free. You can go and check it out. It's all about their tendencies to move around and behave and go in people's houses in Wales. So that is a result of the field study that I did in the population in Colwyn Bay. So Escalapian snakes, I'll explain the whole situation with Escalapian snakes. There are two populations in the UK, one in London on the banks of the Regent's Canal, and one in Colwyn Bay in Wales, which is northwest Wales. And they're no longer a native species in the UK. They were last here something like 150,000 years ago. So they are a non-native species introduced by accident twice. The ones in London were escaped slash got let out from an in London education authority. So they're like living in and around London Zoo and on the banks of the canal, but the escape was nothing to do with London Zoo. And then the ones in Wales, which are the ones I did my PhD on, they escaped from the Welsh Mountain Zoo in the 1970s. They've been breeding in the wild ever since. So what's that? Coming up to 60 years. And yeah, that population is about 70 adults and did some radio telemetry. So we put radio transmitters inside the snakes, tracked them for 2 summers. And the paper resulting from that work is kind of in the pipeline of publishing. So yeah, it's all kind of preliminary, but people can read it if they want to read it. It's online. With regards to the Welsh population, I've sadly got not much left to do with them. Like I'm still working on a genetic study with them. So that will be forthcoming hopefully quite soon. But no one's studying them like formally anymore. I think we kind of answered the questions we wanted to answer of that population. The only way I'm involved with Escalapian snakes now is in the London population. So myself and an ecologist called Ben Wilkie, in collaboration with ZSL, are doing some surveys to try and understand how many individuals are in that population. So we got the license to re-release them because they're a non-native species. Ordinarily, if you catch one, you have to keep hold of it. We got the license from Natural England, so we can let them go again. And we've been marking them and releasing them. We've done it this summer, and we did a tiny bit like last September. So that's still ongoing. And yeah, we hope to have some results from that study. We've caught a few snakes. So yeah, that side of it's still going. But yeah, if people want to, the main one I would say is if people want to read about them, find the preprint. I can maybe give you a link to that or something.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'd love to read that myself, and I'll link it in the description if anyone wants to find it. I'm pretty sure I've seen pictures of people who have caught them in the New Forest.
Uh, in the New Forest.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain I've seen people who have like shown pictures of them with them like in the New Forest. So whether that's like one or two or something, or someone thinks they're funny with like a pet one or something, but I swear I've seen pictures of them in the New Forest because I always had it in my head that there was like a London population, Wales, and a New Forest population.
Wow, I've never heard about that, so I'm not sure.
I'll have
Um,
to have a look. If I can find it, I'll send you the a screenshot of the post or send the post to you.
I mean, if they're in the New Forest, it'd be pretty local to me. That'd be quite
Pretty
convenient.
convenient. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll study them.
Wow.
But yeah, no, I hadn't heard about that. Yeah, who knows? I mean, yeah, could be. We got lots of other European reptiles and other European species popping up all over the place, so you never say never.
Yeah, I'll have a look for you. We'll see what we can find.
Yeah, I know
Um,
there was one in I think it was Ilfracombe, which is like a town. I think that's Devon. One got found. But yeah, I never saw a picture of that one. But I think that was just a one-off escapee. So yeah, I'd be very interested, Leo.
yeah, because I think a lot of people have them as well as pets, so could just be a case of that as well.
Yeah, there's a few people keeping them, aren't there? They're not like overly popular, but there are definitely some people breeding them and keeping them. Yeah.
They're more common nowadays. I see them on like trade lists and stuff.
Oh, do you? That's interesting. Yeah. Maybe they're
Yeah.
having a bit of a resurgence, I wonder.
I mean, but I think because people are more aware that they're like introduced, they also aware that they also have a climate. So the idea of having this big outdoor aviary with them inside and just leaving them to it is like appealing to a lot of people. So
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
do you think captive breeding in herpetoculture has any benefits to conservation? Or do you think that because it's so entwined with strange genetics and morphs, things like that, that it's of no conservation value?
I would never go so far as to say it's of no conservation value. I mean, I think, the sand lizards that we had reintroduced in the UK came from, among other sources, that's just like hobbyist breeders of sand lizards who got really good at it, and then there needed to be some sand lizards for a reintroduction. So they got populations, whether they had their populations or not, whether they were given them, I'm not sure. But those were animals which were reintroduced on an actual conservation project from the hands of hobbyists. So yeah, they definitely can be a use, and I think there is probably capacity in that vein. I also think that what you said about not so much morphs, because I think if people were breeding for conservation purposes, they would probably, and certainly like morphs are really only a relatively few species, aren't they? But I think, yeah, there is probably capacity for hobbyists to be useful in that vein. However, it doesn't take long in captivity before animals start losing functional traits like certain behaviors. Like there are many frog species which in captivity for a while lose their cool. Other animals lose their particular responses to certain predators. So I feel like all these things kind of need to be considered, whether or not those can be relearned, and the ones that first go back out have to just pathfind and be reminded how to do everything. Um, yeah, I think it would need a lot of organization, like a sort of stud book type setup, because realistically, to have enough individuals of an animal to have a sort of fighting chance at genetic variability and stuff, you'd probably need quite a few, which is probably going to be beyond the realms of most individuals to have. Like, no one wants to have like 100 of one species of something. Um, but yeah, I think there's definitely potential. I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think I'd probably err on the same sort of thing. There's probably potential, but in its current form, like no. I think that I mean we again that was another one we covered on the podcast that you sort of alluded to with the golden mantellas and stuff, and that was that what was that Chester Zoo having trouble with the call. That wasn't even that they lost their call. It's just the dynamics, the vocalizations they had. They had a tendency to breed with other individuals that were bred at Chester Zoo rather than wild counterparts or ones that were captively bred more locally. So uh, I think we're a very, very long way from being able to use captive breeding in that way. And I think for the vast majorities of species that captive breeding would have a decent impact on population numbers, we don't have the sort of background ecological knowledge of the animals to do it in a way that would actually work. Um, so I think it's a little bit. I think I think it's a bit over optimistic. If I'm blunt, that captive breeding can have that big of an impact. Maybe if I'm being generous with it, it has a benefit of conservation if you can relieve pressure on from wild collection, I guess. I'm not familiar with any examples of that actually working. I think there might be a case of it with some amphibians in South America, but from what I've seen in the literature, it's pretty scant evidence that that actually works because you tend to have cheaper ways of pulling things from the wild, so potentially building that market or that demand has the opposite, the intended effect. But yeah, I'm sort of falling on basically what Tom said. There's potential, but we're a hell of a long way from it actually being useful.
Yeah, and I think something that's also really important to remember is that most of the species that we have in captivity that are like really widely bred are just like generally tend to be really generalist, like really easy to reproduce, like not that fussed about conditions. And the same goes for, like invasive species. Um, I think a lot of the animals we keep in captivity are sort of good
There's a
candidates for
yeah,
invasion
there's
because they're
yeah.
super generalist and they'll just reproduce really fast. So
Just
yeah,
jumping in, there was a wonderful study that was showing that actually their the prominence and sort of value in pet trade stuff was connected to invasiveness risk. So it was this quite tidy connection, and I'm sure part of it is exactly what you're saying with the ease of keeping, boosting invasive potential as well, right?
yeah. I mean, I just think about the things that I keep, like the little cherry shrimp that I have. They're an invasive species in loads of places because they are a shrimp which carries their young to full term and then they just give birth to live babies. And so as soon as they end up in some warm water, they're just there and they're invasive all over the place. They're even in Germany where there's like warm water outflows. German aquarists change their water and there's like cherry shrimp swimming around in their canals and stuff. So yeah, that's another consideration. Is obviously if you're going to be transporting stuff en masse like that, I guess you've got to consider that they might get out. But yeah, I think, definitely from the perspective of like if there are people who are just like amazing at reproducing like super rare animals, they could be a candidate to like maybe expand what zoos can do or like what other institutions could do. Like, okay, we're going to do a very targeted take into captivity this species which is about to be killed by a fungus, for example. We've got 1,000 individuals. Who would be the best people to give these to in order to try and reproduce them? I could see it in that kind of a capacity. But again, it's like an organization thing, which is a long way away. And yeah,
Yeah,
a really
yeah.
long way away. Like that's a lot of admin.
I find when you get someone that breeds like a UK first of a species that's just it's still like not anything to do with conservation, and because it's the first time someone's bred it in the UK, they'll be like, "Oh, it's a conservation success," and I'm like, bit of an ick for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like what Ben was saying, like it reproducing something in captivity for the first time is no mean feat. And that is an accomplishment. And certainly if anyone was gonna do conservation with it, then that would probably be great intel for them. But yeah, I don't think just getting something to reproduce in captivity intrinsically has any conservation value because those animals have no pathway to the wild.
Yeah, I mean, leading on from that, then, what are your opinions on wild caught?
Um, so I think like whenever we talk about wild caught stuff on the podcast, the first thing that I always try and remember is that catching animals and selling them is like somebody's livelihood somewhere. So,
Mhm.
don't want to just like completely rag on it because it's I don't know. I think we don't really know too much about the sustainability of these things. I mean, Ben's done work on animal like sort of importation and stuff way more than I have. But yeah, I appreciate that we wouldn't have any captive animals if there weren't some wild caught. And it is a livelihood for someone. Like, would I personally want a pet that was wild caught? No, probably not. In fact, definitely not. Like, I just probably wouldn't feel good about it. But yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna like blanket say that I disagree with it.
Fair enough.
I will. Yeah, I think that time's gone. Basically, I think we can be doing way better. The livelihood thing, absolutely, like fair sort of criticism. The stuff I've seen, the capturing animals for the pet trade specifically isn't a particularly stable or predictable livelihood, and I kind of feel like it's used occasionally as a mask for continuing business as usual. Because if that was actually a genuine concern, you could swap out livelihoods for other things if the money and motivation was there. And I do wonder whether it's just sort of used as a bit of a shield. Because I say the stuff I've seen has been yes, people can make money from it, but it wasn't actually any better than some other like cash crops in terms of profit, and it had this added market volatility with it. That was just stuff from Madagascar that I've seen. Whether that's the same in other places, I don't know. But the whole thing just makes me outrageously nervous. I think that we're basically operating in the dark when it comes to wild capture, wild harvesting, whatever you want to call it. Um, I The only study I'm aware of getting a decent sort of grasp on the impacts of pet trade sort of offtake. There's this one. It's a Morton et al. Paper that's basically it's a meta-analysis. So and they're not specifically looking at pet trade. They're looking at just the impacts of what's the sort of generic term? I guess just collection from the wild. Um, and what's immediately apparent with that meta-analysis, oh my God, we don't have nearly enough studies actually getting a good handle on the impact of taking animals from the wild. And the ones they do have are showing almost complete, uh, pretty damn significant declines of these traded animals. I think it was like you're dropping abundance of these populations by 75% where trade is occurring. And I don't think that there are many ways you can justify taking 75% of individuals from a population economically, because that's simply not sustainable, is it? So I I would be quite happy with a very sort of harsh fix for wild caught until there's better data proving it's not impactful. I think for a lot of reptiles, with the sort of sheer demand in things like the pet trade and stuff, that chunks of them just can't be sustainably taken from the wild. I would I think that would be an exceptionally sort of big burden of evidence to really prove that that's not doing harm before anything could be allowed. But we're a long way to having the information to be able to do that. And so in the meantime, I have quite a dim view on it because I don't think you should be doing something unless you know what the impacts are. And we are so far from knowing the impacts. Like Tom alluded, like I work with wildlife trade data, and we've got the best wildlife trade data you can get, but there's massive holes in it, and it's very dubiously collected in places. And there's all sorts of holes from like redactions or species coming from places that they're not native but reported as wild caught. There's stuff that's reported as wild caught but is captive. There's stuff that's captive that's reported as wild caught. And the sort of general state of that monitoring just undermines any confidence I have in making the sort of right decisions on a sustainability in a sustainability sense until that's all addressed. And we're a long way from addressing just the monitoring side of it. So I don't know. I'd say nothing until that can be sorted at the very least.
What do you think about CITES? Do you think CITES does what it's intending to do, or do you think it falls short?
Well, I mean, it's they're doing the best they can, but I think the whole system's backwards, right? So we've advocated in our papers that we just flip the system and go for a green list thing. So instead of having species that you can't trade, you have a blanket, you can't trade species unless it's proven to be okay and proven not to be detrimental to world populations. And I don't know, I think flipping that script is reasonably straightforward conceptually. Like, okay, it's going to be it's going to be dramatically impactful to the industry, but something has to be addressed. Otherwise, we are going to lose more species, and it's not like you can make the argument, oh, there's bigger threats to things. Yeah, sure, but every example we have from like Morton's meta-analysis is showing that, well, it's having an impact, and we kind of need to get we need to do as much as we can, don't we? So if that's a more direct and simple thing we can do while dealing with, I don't know, the habitat loss and the habitat change stuff, why not? Um, yeah, I mean, CITES misses a lot of stuff. We know that for sure. But wildlife trade is complicated. It's going to be complicated to monitor and regulate regardless. Something that's a bit more blanket might be better. I think the whole green list approach is probably better for dealing with species that are just newly described because they're instantly protected unless said otherwise, as opposed to a CITES thing. If you've got to, unless they're in a genus that's already protected, you've got to go through the process of getting them uplisted. You've got to rely on decent ID. You can import something under a different name. Who's going to tell you it's not what it is? Okay, well that needs to be fixed. Species identification stuff. It's a massive task. CITES is doing a lot, but I would be lying if I thought it was enough.
What are your thoughts on the whole argument on if you ban it, it goes underground anyway, and then you can't regulate it?
Yeah, I mean that's so. What's the sort of alternative? Don't ban it and continue it being wild caught and traded. Okay. This is why I'm sort of harping on about the monitoring stuff, is because really you've got to fix the monitoring's got to be sorted out first, and then at least you can keep track of these things. And again, with the sort of overly generous green list approach, is putting the burden of truth on the people profiting it, I think is probably a good start, as opposed to the classic conservation of proving harm before something can be fixed. You should be proving non-harm before. I don't know, the banning in it going underground. I mean, it's a valid concern, but at the same time, I think you've got to try, right? Like if it's doing harm, you've got to try and prevent it.
I think it's one of those where it feels very damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, but the damned if you don't. Like we know what's happening. This we're sitting in amongst this biodiversity crisis. Like damned if you don't looks kind of crap. So I'll roll the dice, and if that works for a whole bunch of species, and creates a whatever, an underground black market for some species, well, at least you've got the legal backing when you do see something being done wrong. Something can be done, as opposed to just be like, yeah, well, it's a shame these are all getting traded. We should try and I don't know, undermine demand or something like that. But yeah, I'll take a roll of the dice.
I think everyone has very strong opinions for or either against, and I think that the big problem I think of these strong feelings is that people like take isolated examples and scenarios and use that as an argument for the whole thing as a whole, rather than thinking it as like it's per species, per economy, per situation, per livelihood. So there's an example of, we went to speak at a conference in Denmark recently, and there was a guy there that goes out to Papua to study the Boelen's pythons, and he'll go up to find the nests with the guides, and they will collect the babies from the nests, but because they're worth so much money to them, and they'll sell them, and they'll leave the adults because the adults will like make them money by producing the next clutch. But their other use locally is for food. So his concern was that if they weren't actually valuable in terms of like for sale, then they're not going to be eating the babies, are they? They're going to be going for things with the meat on it, so it'll be going for the adults. So
there was this is me harping on about the Morton paper, because as far as I'm aware, it's our best broad, generalizable study for this stuff. And for their showing their declines in abundance of animal species, local collection for consumption didn't have the big negative impacts on animal abundance that national and international collection for other purposes did. But again, this, you're looking through the damn keyhole here. They were looking at 506 species. well, that sounds like a lot of species. There's nearly 30,000 species traded. So, there's some examples of it working, some examples of it not working. It's if we're going to go through case by case to work this out, it's going to take a lot of work, and I'm not sure if we have the time to rely on that for some of these. So it is a little bit urgent, and being a little bit more precautionary about it is probably worthwhile. But I don't, yeah, taking animals and having a sort of half justification of, well, someone else would do it, or it's going to happen anyway, or I don't know. I don't know. I'm a little I'm a little lukewarm on it.
What are your thoughts on if someone were to buy a group of wild caught animals and their intention was to breed them in captivity and then sell them at a price that undermines the validity of the wild caught? So they're actually trying to do what they did in South America with dart frogs.
I have a unfortunate. Well, I suspect that it would be completely economically inviable, like just impossible to pull off. Um, I think you would need basically something to subsidize it, something external. I don't think you could create a. I think it's very difficult to create a self-sustaining sort of market there. We do have our examples from was it tokays and I think green tree pythons possibly. But basically, there's a couple of sort of traffic reports out there of trying to work out the economy of mass captive breeding of certain species. And what they ended up uncovering was this doesn't make sense. In fact, it made so little sense that it was essentially evidence of laundering of wild caught animals, just because the wild caught stuff was so cheap. There was just no way you could compete economically. So the business model just wasn't there to have someone keep doing it. So I think it would have to be this. It would have to be subsidized, I think, to keep it alive, basically. And I'm very nervous of any solution that relies on market stuff, basically any market force, just because supply and demand can be so fickle, and if that's the sort of, it's not going to care about the sustainability of anything or the numbers. So I'd rather keep all of it far detached, because let's say you start doing that and it all goes very well, and it boosts the demand for this certain species. It becomes popular, and like, oh, this is brilliant, undermining the wild caught thing. Then the bottom drops out of the market or something. It's completely infeasible to maintain those captive stocks, but the demand's still there. You have this potential to sort of rebound into the wild caught, but potentially even more egregiously than before. Like I'm talking hypotheticals. I'm not saying that that's what would happen, but I'm exceptionally reluctant to trust anything market related when it comes to biodiversity, because I think it's just been such an abject failure up until this point, and kind of the root problem we're trying to address.
Fair enough.
I think once, like Ben's sort of saying there, if an individual species becomes popular, like say there's a TikTok about rain frogs, everyone wants a rain frog, and then you've got this massive demand, so you satisfy that demand, and then oh, no one cares anymore. So then all those breeders stop breeding them. But then that same video emerges again a decade later, and again they resurge in popularity. You're going to keep having this like cyclical thing. And I've always thought that populations of animals in captivity must wax and wane, like the total number of each species. Like right now, there's probably like I would only even hazard a guess, like 10 million royal pythons in the world. But if if they go out of fashion, or I mean, they're probably a bit fashion proof. They're maybe not the best example, but I don't know what's popular at the minute. Like
Mexican black king snakes are a good example.
Mexican black, yeah, totally right, because they were huge in like the 80s, was it 90s, and then they went away. No one was breeding them. You couldn't get one, and now again, it's like, oh, it's a jet black Lampropelis, cool. They're back being popular. So yeah, I just think people also don't really appreciate the weight that we have as humanity on this planet. Like, there are really not very many wild places left. There's not this wilderness that you can go to collect reptiles. Like, even places like Madagascar, Ben used an example, you have to drive 7 hours between the reserves because it's so denuded. Like, these are tiny fragments of what are left. Like humans and our livestock are 96% of mammal biomass on Earth, right? There's 4% left for wild mammals. It's like we're not this like expeditionary force that goes into the wilderness and collects stuff. We are everything, and there's tiny bits of wilderness left for us to go and exploit. So yeah, it's kind of better to think about it in those terms.
Do you think that there's anything that herpetoculture can do to help that in effect with herpetologists or the study out there?
Well, I think how herpetoculturists can help herpetologists.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I think if the answer to that's no, it's probably because of my lack of imagination. I feel like uh directly help herpetoculturists.
Oh, well, you're thinking up. I think there's the whole outreach and education thing, right?
Oh,
Of just
right
getting
on,
people
yeah.
hyped for these animals. I mean, that could be. You've talked about a sort of galvanizing experience, and if that's what's required for people to get on board with conserving these animals or studying these animals, whatever sort of aspect of herpetology you want to describe, I think that's outrageously valuable. Um, I think that's a real for me. The main one is this sort of building these connections and respect with animals that you may not get as close an interaction with, or maybe you won't come across as readily in the wild.
Yeah. Yeah, that is probably the main thing. I mean, certainly when I've done outreach stuff, and obviously I just remember being a kid as well. If I went to a zoo or a garden center and there was a snake out there, I was like, seventh heaven. I was so excited. So, and having been on the other side of that now, showing snakes to kids and stuff, you really see the impact it has on them. And yeah, I think, yeah, reptiles are such like tactile animals as well. Like, it's one thing to watch something on TV, but if you can actually get your hands on it, touch it, experience it, then yeah, I think that does change perspectives a lot.
Yeah, and the sort of leading by example with regarding to sort of respecting the animals and caring about them in a very like welfare orientated way is definitely beneficial, because anything that can just sort of imbue folk with that attitude, it makes, I just went on a massive diatribe about wild caught stuff, but the whole why so much of that makes me so nervous is people treating animals like commodities and products, right? The whole outreach and education thing and getting more connected to individuals could be a very useful sort of antidote to that. They're not just things to collect; they're individuals with their own lives and experiences and needs for welfare and upkeep, right? So, a better culture in that way, that there's I don't want to use anthropomorphizing as the word, but that's essentially it. That uh, creating a connection between people and animals that is more personal makes a lot of the issues we deal with on a more societal level seem more tackleable, because suddenly you're putting these animals in a the sort of correct high priority that they should be over, whatever economic concerns that could get in the way.
I think I'd rather people lean more towards anthropomorphism than what they currently do. Because people are so scared of being accused of being anthropomorphic, they actually lean into mechanomorphism, and it's like, that's not reality either. So if people were like, oh, he seems to love this, and like, oh yeah, this and that, and I think that's better than they just want to be in a box with a water bowl and some pine shavings and bish bash bosh. That's all a snake does, and it's this little machine and of base instinct alone, and that's it. Like, I hate that. So would you consider yourselves, right, let me make sure I get this right, taxonomic lumpers or splitters?
I'd say I'm probably neither. I just like I I mean we the thing is about we cover a lot of new species on the podcast, right? And it is something which is like constantly ongoing. Um and it is quite a controversial area. But I also think that like to really like to sort of unequivocally say whether something is or isn't or shouldn't be a species. I just feel underqualified, really, and it is a subjective thing which there isn't really any answer to. Um, I don't know. Do you have an idea about yourself as a lumper or splitter, Ben?
Uh, it's a tough. Yeah. What is a species, right? Um, I think I have a tendency for thinking of animals as more similar than different. So I guess I would, if I was pushed gun to my head, one or the other, I think I would tend to go for lumper because I think that is the way I think about questions. When you're thinking, okay, animal over here does behavior X, animal over here does behavior Y. If they're lumped as the same species, that makes a much simpler comparison as opposed to why does species this do this and species Y do that, and it can just sort of clean up the language where you can just be like, we're looking at this animal, these ones do this, these ones do that, as opposed to species Y over here does this. So uh that's my sort of gut, is just from a language simplicity thing. Completely non-scientific answer. Other one is if they all kind of look the same, cryptic species are kind of annoying, right? If they're field identifiable as different, then they can be different. If they're not field identifiable, I'll lump them together. It's the ultimate lazy answer, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think there are a lot of like I think if there's like a species which is like geographically isolated, even if it's quite similar to other ones, if there's like no chance that they'll ever be reunited, then considering that species as like a unit for conservation as a species is kind of relevant and just, even if
Yes.
like they might not be that like original. But I do think there are a lot of papers that come out describing species which are like pretty dodgy. And like certainly this is something which has come into the fore more since we were at the World Congress of Herpetology like a month ago. Like there was quite a lot of talk about some of the sort of like consistent problems that you have in species descriptions because everyone loves describing new species, right? It's like super glamorous thing. It's really exciting. Like everyone loves doing it. But a lot of the times you'll have kind of consistent problems occurring with the descriptions where either there's just like really not very good sampling. So you'll take like, say you've got a species with like a really broad distribution. There's one in France. Okay, we'll take one in France. Okay, the species spreads all the way to like Albania, the other side of Europe. We'll take one from Albania and then we'll compare them to see if they're different. And it's like, well, that's like, thousands of kilometers. That species is going to be different across that distance. If you don't sample the ones in between, you're missing out on a massive amount of diversity, which probably makes them appear more different than they are. And in reality, there'll be a gradient of difference as you spread along the length of the range. So I think that's a common problem that people do. Um, and also, yeah, I think there, I think increasingly we understand that we need a lot more data than a lot of papers have. Gone are the days where it was enough to just do
Scat
morphology,
counts.
because morphology for species is like, you know, for lots of things, but particularly reptiles, like Jackson's chameleons can be like 10 centimeters long, or they can be I don't know, 50, 40 centimeters long. It's still the same species, it's just morphological variation. So now that genetics is incorporated, and we're kind of learning more and more that if you don't have the right breadth of genetic information, and that can also come up later on. People try and describe species with very little information, and then subsequent authors come along with more, and it tells a different story. And yeah, all of that stuff is subjective as well to an extent. So yeah, there's a lot of species which are a little bit maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And we've gotten a little bit more selective with our species of the bi weeks, which is a segment we do on our podcast describing a new species. We're kind of getting a little bit more selective with ones we actually choose to do. Because also sometimes you'll see a species and I don't really feel qualified to talk about comment on this myself, but I've had like more experienced academics say to me, like, I think that species of pit viper that's just been described isn't a species, it's actually a hybrid between two neighboring species. Stuff like that goes on as well. So yeah, it's a bit of a quagmire really once you dig into it.
I think the recent paper for the new anaconda is a perfect example because there was a response paper disputing it, wasn't it? And it was like apparently that was really, I've not read it yet, but apparently it's really good, the response. So
To my shame, haven't read it either. That was by both of our old supervisors, Wolfgang and co. So yeah, Wolfgang usually knows what he's on about. But yeah, we deliberately we didn't cover the new anaconda paper on the podcast because it seemed a little bit like maybe a bit of an overreach. But and the thing is with these things, it's nobody's bad intention. Like nobody set out to do bad science. It's just that like a few mistakes were made and whatever. So yeah, I don't really feel qualified to comment on the anaconda. I think that was erroneous and it has now been corrected. But there's a funny thing about that as well is that like a new anaconda it breaks into the news, right? Everyone's like telling me, all my non-reptile friends are just like, "Hey, you heard about this new anaconda?" And you're like, "Yeah, kind of. Not really a new anaconda though." And then, but the retract or the paper which sort of
The
takes
response.
takes the other approach and yeah, and says, "No, actually, this is a bit of an overreach. This maybe wasn't a new species of anaconda." That doesn't make it into the news. So now in the public eye, there's another species of anaconda kicking about, and it's probably gonna to everyone with just a passing fleeting interest, that's gospel now, and it will be probably we'll be hearing about that in 40 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, like going on from that, then what do you think of like mitochondrial DNA used in taxonomy in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was alluding to. And like neither of us are really geneticists, so there are way people far more qualified to answer these questions. But the impression I get now is that if you only have mitochondrial DNA, so like DNA from the mitochondria, it has a few drawbacks, one of which particularly being that it's only inherited through the mother's line. So now authors are going back and adding nuclear DNA, um, like adding sections of nuclear DNA to their analyses to do new phylogenies to try and understand how animals are related. And a lot of times they're getting vastly different results than people who in the past just use mitochondrial DNA. And that's obviously causing quite a lot of consternation and like species being redescribed. But the thing is, it's way more glamorous to describe new species than it is to go back and do the work to actually confirm them. And so it's just not happening. So yeah, a lot of the stuff like we watched a really cool talk at the World Congress about salamanders, and this guy had gone
Yeah.
back like reanalyzed this data set of salamanders and how they're all related in Japan with nuclear data in addition to mitochondrial data, and came up with a different number of species, different distributions for those species. And I mean, the way salamanders inherit their genetics is like complicated as it is, but yeah, that's just an example of how things can be very different if you just use more data. So I think people are now kind of turning away. I think species descriptions which don't have nuclear and mitochondrial data in them are kind of like a bit these days. They're not necessarily looked upon with the same.
It's I think the frustration for me comes from it, right? It's not that the data is wrong, right? It's not that the method is wrong. It's that it's being over sort of over assessed, right? You're drawing conclusions on it that are too solid. You're not taking into account certain chunks of uncertainty. So is it really the whole? Let's say you do a study with mitochondrial DNA only. That doesn't make that data set and those findings worth less, right? Not worthless, but worth less. Because you don't have the nuclear, because now we've got better methods for that. It's the sort of subsequent how you discuss it and how you tackle it, because all that is one step towards getting towards a better answer, right? So it's for me, it's I don't want to be critical of the studies that have used it and only used it, because there's a hell of a lot more in terms of like resources and cost and sampling effort and things that can curtail what you can get out of a study of funding, a chunk of funding or something. It's the naming the species stuff that seems to be where the root issue is, because there's so much well, it's not even baggage, but like momentum. Like there's a rigidity to species names, and there's the whole first come first served sort of thing with species naming. So the incentive system in species description to me seems like the real root of the problem, right? Because if you did just do mitochondrial DNA, okay, well, we think there's maybe this species, this many species. Well, that's fine. Someone could come along and be like, well, we did the nuclear bit on top of that, and we think it's this many species. That's fine. But if there's an incentive to do something quicker, faster, potentially less rigorous because you get the naming rights, well, there's your issue.
Yeah, and even
Mm.
if you name a species and then it subsequently gets changed, if you are describing something new in a place, it has to have that original name, even if some specifics get changed. So,
Right.
like, even if you don't really know what you're doing, you can name something and that name will have to stick because of the International Convention on Zoological Nomenclature, which is like the big document that everyone has to adhere to.
I mean, that's just Hoser. Is it Hosier or
Oh,
Hoso?
so
Yeah, it's
yeah,
the whole thing,
yeah,
isn't
he's
it?
had a few that stuck because of that. Although people do seem to just be like discrediting his names now and not using them sometimes, even if they are technically valid, just because of how unbelievably unvalid his papers were. At least that's my understanding. But
But
yeah, that's
that's
the
a
whole,
slope, isn't it? That's where you make that cutoff of invalid to valid is
yeah.
depending on how you're interpreting the science. And throw it forward 80 years, you can might have gone through the DNA. It's not even worth looking at anymore. Who knows?
Yeah. But yeah, it's still, yeah, there are still so many species being named, and you do wonder whether, yeah, a lot of it I'm sure will change, but I don't know. The thing is, as well, I still find it exciting to hear about new species, even though I know that so many of them are a little bit potentially tenuous. I still think it's really cool aspects of herpetology, which is like exciting and fun and new.
But it's the mystery, isn't it? It's the mystery of finding something that's completely fresh. I mean, that's why the species of by week still sticks around, even if not all the species that we chat about on species of by week will stick around. It's fun, isn't it? It's step along progress. It's science. Of course, they're not all going to stick around, either from not existing or because they've been sort of half dubiously described.
You've
It's
given me
just
an idea
progress.
for a segment now, Ben. We could go back and do like species of the bye week. Where are they now? Like what percentage of them are still like actually
I
recognized?
would, yeah.
That's so
If you want to go
cool.
back and do the legwork on that, I'm keen. Trying to work out the validity because that's going to be a judgment call, man. That's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. Like, if you want to find out the most recent up-to-date name of an animal, there isn't really a good way to do that.
Reptile database. That's what I go by.
Well, you can go on Reptile Database, but all that does is Reptile Database is amazing, but as I understand it, all it does is accumulate the most recent time that animal's name was used in a research paper that got published. And so
That seems like a reasonable proxy when you make try
it's
and work with
reasonable.
12,000 reptile names. You've got to make some concessions.
Yeah, I know, but I don't think changing it every time someone flippantly uses something different is the best way.
Well, no, you got to grab all the synonyms too.
Yeah, I think it should be like most common synonym over the last 4 years, unless there's like a specific paper which like provides evidence to counter it, and then that should take precedence.
Yeah,
But someone's
that's
got to,
legwork, dude.
that's the thing,
That's
someone's got
big
to do the legwork.
legwork.
And I am so grateful for Reptile Database. I think it's a fantastic resource. But yeah, it's definitely, yeah. The way that those are, as I understand it, the way that those are estimated is just by who said what most recently.
I think of China. Throughout all of that, I was thinking of China, where I know there's a lot of undiscovered species and like a lot of them being discovered all the time. I know China has like this big like firewall, or it's really hard for us to see what papers are published in China or whatnot. Do you think there's any species that are known to Chinese science that us in the West don't know about? Or is it they're a bit more flow than what I'd imagine?
I
I
don't
think
know.
sci- I think
Go on, Ben.
scientific literature there's pretty decent flow when it comes to
Yeah.
stuff like that. I
Yeah,
think
when
whether
go on.
there's species, sorry, I was thinking whether there's species known to people in places that we don't know as, whatever you want to group in as the West. Yeah, 100%. Just, the sheer rates of biodiversity in places, people are going to be aware of things that the scientific community, English speaking scientific community as a whole are not. Um, I don't know. I think that you see plenty of papers coming out of China with newly described species, so I assume the flow's pretty decent because
Yeah.
we
Am I
see
just
them.
Am I wrong in thinking there is like a whole load of Chinese literature which is in Chinese that just doesn't get translated? Is that just something I've picked up somewhere that isn't true?
Oh no, there is, because I've tried to find some stuff.
Yeah, there is. Okay, yeah. Yeah, but to answer your question, Liam, I'm not sure to be honest. I could see it being true, but equally, like Ben says, we just did a paper about a Chinese species being described last week. So a lot of them are certainly published in English and published in places like Zootaxa, where the only barrier to getting them is the horrendous firewall, which is Zootaxa.
Well, that's good then. Do you think you Do you have any tips for people that go herping on how to be like as non-destructive as possible to the habitat?
I would definitely say people should be going herping. It's amazing fun. In terms of tips, I think most people know that like people who herp kind of have an idea of what's ethical and what's not. You know, if you turn something over, turn it back over. Um, when you're taking pictures of stuff, you should remember that it's a sentient being and not just like hap it endlessly until it's exhausted. Uh, Something which me and Ben have spoken about a little bit is like if you're going with guides, just make sure that they're like behaving responsibly with the wildlife. Like, you know, check out their stuff and see that they're actually being responsible. And if you're doing stuff in other countries, make sure people have permits for what they're doing. Um, is another one I would suggest is good. It doesn't hurt to ask people if they've actually got like legal rights for what they're doing. Yeah. Those are the kind of main ones I'd say if you're trying to be a responsible herper. But yeah, I mean, definitely try and get out and see some of these animals in the wild. It is an incredible privilege. And yeah, just some of the best moments of my life have been while herping.
I've got a bonus one. Um, don't just look for herps. So, look for bugs, birds, mammals, whatever. Soften the motivation for the sort of deep need of having to turn over everything. If your goals are more wide, potentially that'll mitigate the motivations for doing something that is more destructive. Because really, at the end of the day, if you're observing wildlife, everything you're doing, what's the whole take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints idea, right? So yeah, I say spread a wider net so you're less likely to be disappointed and less likely to be motivated into uh more aggressive methods, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a nice idea to spread the net more widely, Ben, but unfortunately impossible. Just looking for snakes 24/7. It can't be
Yeah,
done.
but come on, you've seen some pretty awesome bugs out there.
Seen some cool bugs, yeah.
You like a fish?
I like a fish, yeah, but you don't see
Yeah.
fish when you're walking around. They're in the water.
I don't know. I've seen plenty of fish walking around.
We did see some nice tetras actually in Borneo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, you do have to widen the net. And actually birds, when you give them a chance, are quite cool as well. So,
See,
and you
yeah,
can
good.
reliably see birds, which is not always the case for snakes.
We've got a Patreon question here. Where do you find the audio for your frog calls for your episodes?
We tend to find them on this website called Amphibia Web, which is like a repository where you can go and see what all the amphibian species are, and many of them have calls associated with that. So it's like a really nice database for like amphibian ecology, but also you can find calls on there for like a large proportion of them. So we tend to just yeah, lift them off there. Or increasingly, me and Ben have had the good fortune to record a few frog calls, or uh, Ben's partner. Ben's partner originally recorded one for us. And so yeah, there's that. Some of them we record ourselves, and then occasionally people send us them. Like we'll have listeners send in frog calls, which is always great.
Or gecko
Um,
calls.
yeah, or gecko calls. Yeah, somebody like squeezing their pet gecko and it's making like an alarm call. We'll use that. So yeah, generally amphibia web, but we'll take them from anywhere.
Nice. So our final question after 2 hours is, who is your inspiration that we may or not have heard of?
I find these sorts of questions really difficult because I have a natural uh, disinclination to put this sort of thing on individuals because I'm very sort of pro death of the author, like forget who did it, focus on ideas. So uh, I'm gonna sidestep it from like a person and instead pick a sort of organization because I think like those are the things that sort of keep me going is when I see a sort of group of people tackling a problem in a particularly novel way. And so my go-to, what came to mind for me, it might not be the most inspirational thing for me, but are the hero rats. The African pouched rats that are trained to identify unexploded ordnance and landmines, as well as tuberculosis. I think actually they're being moved into also tracking down illegal wildlife trade items like ivory and things. But it's sort of projects like that are very, animal human sort of working together for just tackling very unambiguously egregious problems in a way that I wouldn't have thought possible. Like it's that sort of bringing something completely fresh and unexpected and doing a really damn fine job of solving something. In a similar vein, I think here in Scotland with the beaver reintroductions is another one that I find quite inspiring. It's very fixing things through an animal-centric perspective is probably how I'd summarize it, and that's the sort of thing that has inspired me, certainly.
I've got a more traditional answer, although I did like that, Ben. I like the hero rats as an idea as well. They're just completely willing to sacrifice themselves, whatever the cost. Those rats would
Well,
do
I
it.
mean, they don't need to sacrifice. That's the beauty of them.
I
They
thought
don't
they were
set off the
rats that
landmines.
they don't set off the landmines.
No,
and
no, they don't send.
Right.
They don't send rats out into a landmine to get
I thought they
blown
were
up.
just
What
like.
sort of mad? No,
I
absolutely.
thought that's what they were for. They're a dispensable animal.
No, absolutely not. No, they're highly trained professionals that work for years on the job and then happily retire.
Okay, so they're not just like martyrs that run up to
Absolutely not. No, no.
Like,
This is.
I'm less,
Helm's Deep style.
honestly, less impressive now. Less inspiring, definitely. But for me is when I was a kid, my mum used to take me to the Thames and Chiltern Herpetological Society because I grew up in Bucks, and there was loads of really cool people there who like when I was a teenager like really just talked to about reptiles basically and like was heavy into it. But there was one guy there called Matt Rendell who was, and people might have heard of him to be fair, but he was the lead veterinary nurse at ZSL for a while. He's still a veterinary nurse, but he was at that um Thames and Children Herpetological Society, and he probably wouldn't remember me, but like when I was a kid, I like chatted to him for ages about snakes, and like he was like an adult who knew loads of stuff and was like super enthusiastic. So yeah. And I mean, I've been lucky. There's been a host of people like that in my life, to be honest. But yeah, he definitely sticks out as someone. And everyone else at Thames and Chiltern Herpetological Society was great as well. So yeah, that'd be me.
I think that's a great answer. And I like the rats as well. The rats is a cool idea. And I never really thought that anyone thinks of like the death of the author sort of concept. And that's the first time that's really been introduced to me, to be fair.
I'm so on board with it because I feel like it tackles the whole naming things after people get it all out of here. I hate a lot of the biological concepts that somebody's names whatever, a Allen's rule or a Moore's law or whatever like that. No, just name the damn thing something descriptive, and then I won't have to. Well, look what Tom was saying. Remember people's names.
I think there's a lot of icon worship in both herpetoculture and herpetology as well, and I don't like much of it, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like there's definitely some importance in like recognizing that people have done good things, and like everyone's kind of sequentially got us to this point, and like you don't want to start like ragging on people back in the day, but we also
I might be overcorrecting, but
yeah, I don't know.
We'll meet somewhere in the middle and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Well, we've been going for 2 hours now, so final thing, could you guys let the viewers know where to find you?
Yeah, sure. So you can find our podcast, Herpetological Highlights. It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those normal places. We've also just recently started filming it, so you can find us on YouTube now. We've got a blossoming YouTube channel. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, it's herp_highlights, or I'm on there at Tom_E_major. Ben, you're not really a social media guy. Do you want to shout out any social media?
No, I'm all right.
It's good. Yeah.
No, honestly, getting in touch via the podcast is the way to go.
Oh yeah. You can always just get in touch with us that way. We love hearing from people. So.
All right, brilliant. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, guys. It's been a pleasure having you on. We have listened to your podcast for years now, to the point where Ellie's put it on as we're going to sleep, and I wake up to a frog call, being really confused. So yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks a
Well,
lot,
it's been
guys.
great.
That means a lot. That's really kind. And thanks for having us. Yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, great podcast. Keep it up.